Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am Mr. Blubberbutter. As we are currently experiencing police brutality, violence, protests, and a plague forcing us to isolate, I decided I needed a distraction. Video games. So I decided to play Pathologic 2, a game about violence and an abusive military overreaction to a deadly plague that's killing everybody. Escapism is an important tool, in moderation, and as a psych nurse I just wanted to point that out. This was self-care. Now, this game is known for being really difficult, so much so that they give you several warnings about tweaking the difficulty, and they mention it on their front page. This game is designed to be punishing. And having finished the game, I have some conflicting thoughts and emotions on their definition of difficulty. Therefore, this video is a little less of a review, and a little more of an exploration of difficulty. At least, a very specific type of video game difficulty. So here's the thing, in my opinion, this game is not that challenging. It's just tedious. Okay, that's not entirely true. The game actually is quite challenging as well. It's just done in such a way that it makes the overall experience more tedious than skillful. Intentionally, and arguably geniusly, but I'll get to that. You start the game off by having to run through or fistfight through every single street just to get to your first objective. On the default settings, you can't take very many hits, plus the first strike from an opponent stops you and turns you around anyway, forcing you to engage with the enemy, and making it much harder to run away. When you aren't being physically assaulted, you have to fight to keep your hunger, thirst, sleep, and infection meters in shape, and by default, each meter runs down excessively fast. Managing this is like a horrible game of Sims where failure means replaying huge chunks and even hours of the game, repeatedly. It's not as simple as just remembering to stop by a refill station either. As the game progresses, food, water, medications, and sleep are increasingly harder to manage and harder to find resources for. I mean, I guess not for sleep. Beds are pretty common, but you're also missing objectives if you sleep too much, so there's, managing your time. Very mild spoilers here, but combine this with the fact that when you die, you permanently lose overall health, stamina, things like this. You start having permanent consequences. It just really hammers home the point that this game is meant to be difficult. All of this difficulty was meant to be intentionally frustrating, and it was. I think they fully succeeded in what they set out to do. I just have conflicting thoughts about whether or not it was worth it. But I'll get there. First, let's look for a second at the team's statement about difficulty. I've always believed that games were a medium capable of delivering all kinds of compelling experiences, and that set experiences don't need to be conventionally pleasant to be interesting and fulfilling. Pathologic 2 was always intended to be grueling, stressful, and bleak. We believe in little narrative cohesion and aren't too fond of stories that are only dark and hurtful on the cover. However, we also believe, even firmer, in player freedom. I actually have a lot of respect for this statement. It's clear, respectful, and it makes their intentions well known. As a writer myself, I read this to mean we are writers first, and game devs second. I think that's really cool, honestly. Despite some of the complaints I'm about to mention, this is pure storytelling. Let me repeat, we aren't too fond of stories that are only dark and hurtful on the cover. In other words, the gameplay must match the story, and that's really hard not to respect. I applaud that dedication. Even if I wasn't overly fond of the end result, that's respectable. Now, I'm going to come back to this. There are several important concepts here that deserve a little more detail, but I'll need to bring up some complications first. They directly tell you that the atmosphere is supposed to be oppressive and add to the horror of the player. But I don't think that really worked for me, not in a horror aspect anyway, in the very least not in a traditional sense. I didn't feel scared or oppressed really, it just made me angry and irritable. I'm not gonna lie, I wanted to quit more than once, and I would have missed some of the better aspects of this game. But that was also the point. So was making that point an improvement for the game? I don't know. To a certain degree, sacrificing gameplay elements for narrative can be very effective, but if you sacrifice too much, the game isn't enjoyable enough to warrant a continued playthrough, and I'm worried that they might have been pushing that boundary. See, a typical horror game tries to balance two elements, stress and fear. And when you are scared, stress disguises itself as intense fear. So if you're running from a chainsaw-wielding douchebag, and turn the corner to find 3 more chainsaw-wielding douchebags, you might be scared. But it's mostly the stress of avoiding 3 more enemies. Your mind kind of blends the two. Pathologic 2 goes in a different direction. They definitely included the stress, but they neglected the fear. They leaned heavily into difficulty and marketed this as horror. But the thing is, stress and fear can go well together, but in the right quantities. An excess of stress creates irritation, and irritation and horror do not mix. Not well, not usually. And like I said, on one hand, I very much respect the attempt and dedication to the narrative. But from a gameplay point of view, this seems like a lethal miscalculation. This setup makes it difficult to enjoy the game, and if you do not enjoy the game, there's very little keeping you engaged in playing. Very little of this game is actually scary. There were a couple of moments, a haunted, or infected rather, house, being chased down by monsters of sorts with screaming people in the background, but the vast majority of the game isn't scary. It's just weird. Weird is good, by the way. In all its bizarre glory, I actually really loved figuring out the town. I didn't enjoy playing the game, nearly at all, but I did get very attached to the town. I almost feel like it would make a really, really cool D&D campaign if tweaked a little bit. I might actually have to mess with that idea. I'll let you know how that goes. Okay, I need to take a slight detour to mention choices. It's kind of relevant, but let me get to it. At first, I didn't really know how I felt about them. The verbal choices are very weird. Very weird. It's often very difficult to determine the tone and your responses based on what they give you. Almost all of the choices in the game are very vague. Multiple times, I didn't actually know what I was deciding, or even if there were other options. The dialogue has a weird way of taking sharp turns in the middle of conversations, and suddenly I'm left with 4 different responses, each of which sound awfully important, but also don't really amount to much. It took me a good long time to realize that most of the dialogue options only affected the immediate future. Whether or not I accepted a quest, whether or not I can keep a district clean for the day, whether or not I needed to shell out money for resources, or how much a specific person liked me, whether or not my favor with them would grow or shrink. But then, not always. Some flippant dialogue options actually did decide life or death for other people. It was constantly jarring, but it did keep me on my toes and force me to remain attentive while listening to long stretches of dialogue, or reading rather. The sound dialogue didn't really match what was being said. It was a little odd, to be honest.
For the usurer wages war on all poorer. Just nailed barley down. Here we go, all around.
The fucking fuck was that? Then again, the entire game was odd. That's kind of the point. How does this relate to difficulty? Very vaguely. It is there, but it's a little hard to notice at first. While most of the choices don't immediately affect difficulty, they do affect how you're approaching the world, and sometimes what some of your objectives are, which affects how you're tackling this problem. The problem is the way that a lot of these are phrased. It's difficult to know what the questions are even meaning, or what the ramifications for the choices actually are. In a way, you're actually writing your character through your verbal choices. At least, I think so. For instance, you are once asked if you were married. You can respond with, I was, or I am, or not yet, maybe never. So which one is it? Am I lying when I'm choosing one, or am I creating my own backstory? It's odd, because you're not role-playing an avatar, you're role-playing an actual character, but it's hard to role-play that character because they never really give you a clear idea of who you are, the character you are. Plus, the game expects you to be rude to some people, and it's nice once you realize that, but your responses to others make a pretty big difference. A grieving child can be comforted and actually adopted by you, or in that same dialogue option, you can call him out and tell him to live and die alone. It's weird because these dialogue choices feel like actual choices, and they feel meaningful, but they don't really impact the game in any way, shape, or form. It's just how you, the player, feels about it. Now, this ramble has gone on for a little while, but if you haven't gathered what I'm trying to say, what I'm saying is that you're tackling and exploring this world without really knowing who you are and what's going on in the process. That adds to the difficulty because you're trying to figure things out, and you're trying to figure out what is wrong and what is right, and what things are going to stab you in the back and which ones aren't, and it's not really clear how you do that based on your dialogue choices, because you as the player don't know what the character knows, and they aren't revealing everything the character knows as you, the player, are figuring it out. It's done in such a weird, quirky way. It's something I can't quite put my finger on. Many of these choices you make take place as just simple dialogue options. They almost seem flippant and nothing special, and while that is more grounded in a way, it also removes the weight of a lot of the decisions, making them feel meaningless and disjointed, while still being under your complete control. I think that this is genius, but I can't explain why I think this is genius. It's just really quirky and something you have to experience to understand exactly what I'm saying. Now let me wrap up this tangent and bring it back to the main point, which is the difficulty of the game. And here's the problem, is that I feel like one or the other could have been enough. The tedious nature of the original game was difficult enough without also feeling like I was lost and had no clue what was going on. What I think would have been better was allowing me to feel lost and like I didn't know what was going on. This was plenty oppressive enough for me not really knowing where I fit and feeling like an outsider without also having to micromanage everything and be stressed the whole time. Feeling lost and feeling like every choice I made was wrong was plenty oppression for me to be able to enjoy the game. The time element also would have been plenty enough. You're already forced to miss content in the game. kind of going back to the in-game decisions, the game is designed to force you to choose what you want to and what you are willing to do. You cannot save everybody, you cannot be everywhere, so you need to decide how you are going to allot your time, and consequently, what content you will experience and what content you will miss. Thematically, this is an amazing idea. This adds a certain level of replayability and realism, but the nature of the game makes me unlikely to ever want to replay it again, just to see some of the missed content. Plus, some of the various decisions and scenes aren't laid out as checklists, so it's unclear what things can be changed and which ones can't. Missing a quest sometimes doesn't even register. I don't realize that I've missed a quest until well after the fact. So is it really worth replaying hours and hours of gameplay just to save a single NPC, to experience a different dialogue or a different scene, when you don't even know what effect that would actually have? I would argue no. I have no interest in replaying the game. I at this point need a break before I can even play the DLC. But at this point I want to go back and look at that initial statement we looked at earlier. Further down, they give a little more detail. Pathologic 2 was balanced around 3 principles. 1, we want the player to always balance on the verge of death, but also to always have an opportunity to drag themselves out, perhaps loading a save or 2 back. That's why the game keeps a full history of your saves. 2, we want the player to be forced to sacrifice cool and interesting content due to their survival needs. To be always short on time and not being able to achieve an optimal playthrough. The story of Pathologic 2 was written to be caught glimpses of, not unfold completely. And number 3, we want the player to do things that clearly feel wrong, like voluntarily thrashing their reputation or using the healing items that could have saved someone. Among other things, Pathologic 2 is an exploration of selfishness, and that video games often allow us to completely disregard as a factor. With this in mind, you can revisit some of the points I've made before. I don't think it invalidates any of the complaints I have, but it does address them. It means that they have accounted for the complaints I've had, and they've made an intentional decision. As previously mentioned, the question now at this point is, was it worth it? And to that, I do not know. At all. I have really conflicting thoughts. When I initially started writing this video, it was very clear to me that this game sucked, that this was not a good game in the slightest, that they made the wrong call. But after thinking about it some, I'm not so sure. They did several things really well. One thing I didn't really touch on because I went on a tangent about choices a little too long, it was a little irrelevant, but you did develop as a character, and my approach toward the town did change substantially. I started off being kind of hostile and irritable towards the people who just kept attacking me for no reason and their weird decisions. But at the end, I was being much more respectful. I got adopted into the town. I started using their terminology whenever possible. I tried to respect the quirky nature of the town. And I actively disliked the game, but I still kept playing. And that says something, because I have no problem quitting a game that I don't think is good. I've quit several games. I'm an adult with a job and family. I don't have the time to throw into a game that I do not enjoy. So if I still played it, even without enjoying it, that means something went well, right? At the end of the game, I was relieved to be able to uninstall the game. But I also wasn't sorry that I played it. And so there's a balance there, and you'll have to figure out what you think about it yourself. I don't know that I can fully recommend the game, but if you know what you're getting into, you might enjoy it. What it really comes down to is that this game is an amazing game for a very specific type of gamer, and you have to have the right mindset. Me, as a 27-year-old father, husband, and nurse, I don't always have the time to get lost in a punishing and unenjoyable experience. Replaying several hours of gameplay isn't as viable or as enjoyable now as it used to be, and that has significantly flavored my opinion. It took 61 hours to complete this game. I just want to point that out. And like I said, I wasn't playing around and trying to be a perfectionist. I was just trying to get to the end of the game. So that's a huge investment for somebody who doesn't have a lot of time to invest into things. I'm legitimately curious about your thoughts, though. People, I'm sure, have very different opinions about this. If you would like to respectfully discuss it in the comments, I'm actually very interested. This has been a very interesting game. One of the most interesting games I've played, even if I didn't really enjoy it. I think we can all agree on one thing, though, that this is the scariest part of the game. No, not the image, the name. Why? Why the fuck? Who the hell does that? Why would you name a remake after, like it's a fucking sequel? Like, seriously, that is the sign of a sociopath. That is the sign of somebody who is dangerously unstable. You stay the fuck away from people like that.